So thank you. I'm going to try to follow up all of these great presentations by talking about my own specifications grading in my large lecture introductory physics class. Now, as opposed to some of our previous speakers, I'm actually doing this right now. And I taught this morning and had office hours, and now I'm immediately going into this. So I apologize for missing the morning session for this, but I was doing active research and seeing how specification gradings can work out. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about this class as a whole. Physics classes tend to be a little bit divisive, and this class tends to be quite divisive. It's electricity and magnetism, the introductory class, and it's part of a sequence of introductory physics classes that people will take on their way to becoming a scientist or an engineer. We have a different series for, say, biological sciences and scientists in engineering, but pretty much every physical science major in engineering will probably have to take this course at some point. It's also kind of a course that you can't really get around of using vector calculus. And part of that tied in with kind of historically low grade distributions means that people really don't look at this course with enthusiasm and instead look at just what can I do to get the good grade to get out of it. So this is kind of the challenges that we face going into it. We kind of have 4 different areas of electricity and magnetism that we look at. And there's quite a bit of concerns we have with thinking about how to make specification grade work out. One is trying to make sure that this is being viewed by the students as a way of helping them achieve the learning goals and be able to move through their careers and having something useful. The other is making sure that they have the time for learning, but doing so in an equitable way. So we don't want to do this in a sense where students who maybe have a second job and are having some struggles trying to make the class are the ones that are going to be most hurt from having too many retakes and other things outside of the classroom. And likewise, we have lots of assessments, and we need to make sure that the workload that we're putting on the instructional staff is something that is reasonable. We don't want to end up in a situation where we just have so much regrading that we're just unable to do it for the limited number of TAs and instructors that we have. So these are kind of the concerns we have going into it. If you're not familiar with how these kind of large lecture introductory physics classes go, the traditional assessment would be a midterm and a final, where both of those can be worth the vast majority of the grade. Typically in our department, it ends up being somewhere between 45 and 55%, and then the remaining ends up being split between the online homework, usually administered through something like the homework attached to the textbook. So in our case, it's mastering physics. And then some kind of participation and discussion grades that are around 5 to 10%. What we've seen historically, though, is that because those other grade distributions tend to be either all or none, students either get full credit for those smaller buckets of points or none, that really the entire grade ends up being determined by the performance on a midterm and final, which is problematic in and of its own right. But if we think about it in that sense, then that gives us some motivation for how to properly employ a specification grading in the course like this that isn't actually as disruptive as it sounds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I employ different educational techniques in this classroom and how specification grade is working out right now. Unfortunately, I don't have any data showing how well it's working yet because we're midway through the quarter. But first, a little bit about the philosophy of the class. So in this class, we use an elicit, confront, resolve philosophy. So the idea is we want students to come to class prepared. And the way that we enforce this is by having pre-lecture quizzes and videos that are basically what traditional lecturing would be. They're not required to either watch the videos or do the reading. They can kind of choose which one is a better fit for them. And then there's a series of multiple choice questions where the idea isn't necessarily, did you understand the material, but did you see the material? So which form of this equation might be the correct one? Which one of these definitions is the right definitions? Things like that where you can get the right answer by paying close enough attention to either the online videos or the reading. And by doing this with the spirit of specification grading, they can take it as many times as they want. Canvas has a delay between quizzes feature that we use, so people can't just spam it. They actually do have to take some time to go back and check their answers. And then when students come to class, they've at least all seen the material, maybe if they don't understand the material. We also have a module in the quiz that allows them to go ahead and solicit questions. So if they have something that really doesn't make much sense, they can submit it, and then we'll have that be sent to me prior to the class so that I can make sure to address any questions in the reading prior to class. The class itself is a flipped classroom style of instruction. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But in the lecture itself, that's where we actually do the physics. We run through a series of different questions that challenges the students to face different misconceptions they might have, and then we openly discuss them in small groups. Finally, we have the resolution of that. And so afterwards, students have homework, and this is administered online, where they can take a look at slightly more complicated versions of the problems that we've seen in class, as well as having some online simulations where they can maybe play with some of the more abstract concepts through a digital representation. So this is a picture of my Canvas page on the right. So students can see what their reading is. They can click on the lecture. They can go through and have different questions from class where they can play with things virtually. So at the bottom of this, sorry, it's not coming out very well, but there's a DC circuits. They can move resistors and wires and connect them in different ways and visualize how charge is flowing through them. So every week on their weekly roadmap, they'll be able to see a lot of different ways of looking at the same material. In class, like I mentioned, we do a flipped classroom style where we're using the Poll Everywhere service instead of iClicker to reduce cost burden on the students. And we'll go ahead and ask students questions first on their own, kind of see how the students perform on that. And in many cases, we'll see a split between 2 or 3 answer choices. And then we'll break in a small group discussion where students will be in their groups and try to converge around an answer choice. We use learning assistants in our classroom. So these learning assistants will go around and help facilitate the conversations. And we also use assigned seating. So students will be in a group of students throughout the quarter. And then we can also arrange the students so that they'll have easy access for the learning assistants. How we do the actual assessments, like I said before, the main assessment tools that we've had in these large lecture physics end up being the midterm and final. And so one way of thinking about that is taking something like the 8 questions that we'd have distributed through these midterms and finals and breaking them up into individual components. And so with that, we tie it for each major question or topic, we have our associated set of learning goals. And with those learning goals, we can divide those into mastery and exceeds mastery categories. We have 8 assessments that we use to go ahead and apply to the students, and each one is about 20 minutes. So at the end of the day, the sum of all the assessments together is still the same as the amount of time they might invest in the midterm or final. Each one of these assessments has either a core or an advanced designation. If it's a core designation, it's required for the passing of the class. The advanced designations allow us to go ahead and apply a higher grade to it, which I'll discuss a little bit more in the next slide. And the assessments themselves are printed out. They're on one paper, and we administer them through our discussion sections. We choose 20 minutes for a couple different reasons. One is that it's a short enough time so we can answer our questions and have questions that we can do relatively quickly without being overburdened, getting lost down in the weeds of things. But then the other reason is because that allows us to administer a couple different types of assessments in the same discussion section. So we can reserve the first half of the discussion section for that week's assessment, but then we can reserve the second half of the discussion section for any kind of retakes that we may need to take. The way that we do the grading of this is there's a series of questions that you have to answer all correctly in order to get mastery, and then a couple questions at the end for the exceeds mastery. Essentially, we're not looking for necessarily showing exactly the right answer or following things all the way through to their logical conclusion, but we're looking at a lot of, do you know how to set the problem up, and do you know how to, so in this case, how to draw and visualize and set up the physical situation that we'd be presenting. And each one of these smaller questions on here is built into one of the learning outcomes that the students have ahead of time. This is our rubric for looking at mastery. We have 4 different components that we look at for grades. One is the class participation. We assess this with the Poll Everywhere. We also have the pre-lecture quizzes. So once they do the reading or watch the video, we have a multiple choice question on that administered through Canvas, the online homework, as well as the assessments that I just previously mentioned. And whether you get mastery or exceeds mastery on that is based on, for the participation, how much you participate. For the pre-lecture quiz, how many times you submit the quizzes with fully correct answers. These quizzes are 5 questions each, and you could retake them as many times as you need up until the lecture begins. And then for the online homework, we do use a point system, and then mastery has a threshold of 60%, whereas exceeds mastery has a threshold of 90%. And so in this way, again, we're never looking for perfection everywhere. If you do consistently well in everything, you will be rewarded for that. But likewise, if you do better in one and not so good in another, you're not going to be penalized for that. The final way we're going to be sending grades out in the class is using the following rubrics. So they're mainly based around those core assessments that determines your overall letter grade. So if you say, the minimum requirement for passing the class is completing the 4 core assessments. If you do more than that, like say do the online homework and get mastery in that, we have a couple different options for achieving a B and an A level grade. And the reason we choose a couple different options is, again, to reinforce the idea that you don't have to be perfect in everything. So you can either have several quizzes where you exceeds mastery in, or you can have a broad range of quizzes or assessments where you have shown mastery in. So if you do enough of the mastery in the advanced courses, you can still get a good grade. If you get show mastery in everything, you get an A in the class. But likewise, you can also just show exceeds mastery in the 4 core and 2 of the advanced and still receive an A. The class participation in the online homeworks we use then as the modifier. So that's how you get a plus or a minus. So if you participate in class, do all the online homework, sorry, that should say pre-lecture quiz, not online homework down here, then that will give you a plus. If you don't show mastery in those, then you'll receive a minus. And I think that's just about it for time. And so hopefully we'll have a way to revisit this in a few months where I can show a lot of the data about how the students performed with this. Real quick, the way that we administer tokens is with feedback surveys. We have a lot of feedback surveys throughout the course. One of the feedback surveys we do use is a research assessment tool that can assess the learning goals of the students independently of what we're doing with our own assessments for the grade. And so at the end of the course, we'd like to look at this and take a look at the analytics to see if our students are learning in the manner that we hope that they are. And thank you everyone for listening.